What becomes of the women left behind when war is won, but the battle is not over? When the victors rise from the ashes of carnage, their real prize is not the wealth of the land, nor the power of the throne, but the wives and daughters of the fallen. The women of war, stripped of their identity, reduced to nothing more than spoils, have stories that are rarely told. Today, we bring them into the light. But before we begin, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? What time zone are you in? Leave a comment below. Your support helps us bring stories like this to those who need to hear them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's your chance. Don't miss out on the truths history tried to bury. When Ottoman forces breached the walls of a rival stronghold, the immediate aftermath was chaos. Soldiers poured through broken gates, swords still wet with blood, eyes scanning not just for treasure, but for trophies of another kind. The protocol was established over centuries of expansion. Defeat wasn't just military, it was total. The ruling family, stripped of power in an instant, became property of the Sultan. And property, in the Ottoman worldview, could be redistributed, repurposed, or destroyed according to the will of the throne. The wives of defeated warriors occupied a unique position in this brutal calculus. They weren't commoners who could disappear into the masses. Their faces had been seen at state dinners. Their bloodlines connected them to networks of power. Their existence was political, whether they wanted it or not. The Ottomans understood something that many empires missed. Killing a king made a martyr, but taking his wife and remaking her life in ways that served Ottoman interests, that sent a different message entirely. That said, your power is so completely shattered that even your family's dignity belongs to us now. The imperial harem in Istanbul was not the pleasure palace of Western fantasy. It was an institution of control, a living monument to the reach of Ottoman power. When the wife of a conquered ruler arrived there, she entered a world governed by rules she didn't know, speaking languages she hadn't learned, surrounded by women whose own stories of loss mirrored hers. The harem held hundreds of women at its peak, arranged in rigid hierarchy, and the newest arrivals, the conquered nobility, entered at the bottom. Historians describe the process as systematic erasure. A woman who had commanded servants in her husband's palace now served others. The silks she wore were chosen by harem administrators. The rooms she occupied were assigned, not selected. Her previous life became something she was forbidden to speak about openly, a ghost she carried inside her chest, where no one could see it scream. Some women were given to Ottoman officials as wives, married off in ceremonies that formalized their new subordinate status. Others remained in the harem indefinitely, their purpose unclear even to them, existing in a state of permanent suspension between their destroyed past and an undefined future. The psychological warfare was intentional. By allowing these women to live in relative comfort while stripping them of autonomy, the Ottomans created something more devastating than a quick execution. They created living proof that resistance was futile, that noble blood offered no protection, that the natural order could be inverted in an afternoon and remain inverted for decades. Not every woman accepted her fate quietly. The records speak of resistance, though the details often come filtered through Ottoman scribes who had reason to minimize such stories. There are accounts of women who refused to convert to Islam despite pressure, who maintained secret communications with remnants of their former kingdoms, who chose poison over submission. These acts of defiance rarely changed their circumstances, but they weren't pointless. In a system designed to erase identity, simply remembering who you were became an act of warfare. One account, preserved in the letters of a Venetian ambassador, describes a Serbian noblewoman brought to the harem after her husband's fortress fell. She was young, educated, and according to the ambassador's source, possessed a will that the harem administrators found unsettling. She refused to learn Turkish. She refused to adopt Ottoman dress. She spent her days in silence, eating only enough to survive. After 6 months, she was found dead in her chambers. The official record called it a fever. The whispers called it something else. A final choice made in a place where choices had been stolen. These stories haunt the historical record precisely because they're incomplete. We know these women existed. We know they suffered. But their own words, their own perspectives, were rarely preserved. They became characters in someone else's narrative, reduced to footnotes in the story of empire. And perhaps that's the cruelest aspect of their fate. Even their resistance was absorbed into the Ottoman legend, becoming proof of the empire's absolute reach. The fate of the wives was bound to the fate of their children, and here the Ottoman strategy became even more complex. Sons of defeated rulers represented potential threats, living symbols that could rally future rebellions. They were often executed, quietly and efficiently, sometimes within days of their father's defeat. But daughters occupied a different category. They could be married into Ottoman families, their bloodlines absorbed and neutralized through strategic breeding. They could be raised in the harem, taught to see Ottoman culture as superior, converted into advertisements for the benefits of submission. Mothers watched this happen with the unique agony of the powerless. They saw their daughters taught to bow toward Mecca when they'd been raised in Christian traditions. They heard them speaking Turkish with fluency that outpaced the mother's halting attempts. They witnessed the gradual transformation of their children into Ottomans, a cultural death that happened cell by cell, year by year, until the child who remained barely resembled the one who'd arrived. Some historians argue that this assimilation was merciful compared to outright slaughter. The mothers were allowed to live, their children were fed and educated, and in some cases, these assimilated offspring rose to positions of influence within Ottoman society. But mercy defined by the conqueror is a hollow thing. It's mercy that still requires you to forget your husband's face, to stop speaking your native tongue, to participate in the very system that destroyed everything you knew. It's mercy that feels more like drowning in slow motion. Every neighboring ruler understood the subtext. Every king or prince who considered defying Ottoman expansion knew what awaited not just him, but his family if he failed. This was deterrence through horror, statecraft, written in the language of intimate destruction. It wasn't enough to defeat armies. The Ottomans made sure that defeat infected every aspect of life, reaching into bedchambers and nurseries, pursuing its victims not just through death but through transformation. The psychological impact rippled outward. Alliances were forged not from strength but from terror of the alternative. Kingdoms paid tribute they could barely afford. Rulers surrendered daughters as diplomatic hostages before armies even marched, hoping that voluntary submission might purchase better treatment than forced conquest. The wives who had already fallen into Ottoman hands became cautionary tales. Their suffering invoked in throne rooms across Europe and the Middle East, as diplomats argued for appeasement. This terror had a name in several languages, variations on the same theme. In Serbian, it was spoken as a mother's warning to ambitious sons. In Hungarian, it was invoked when debating whether to fight or flee. The specific stories changed with each telling, growing more baroque with distance, but the core truth remained consistent. Losing to the Ottomans meant losing everything, in ways that made a clean death on the battlefield seem almost preferable. What haunts us now, centuries later, is how many women's names we'll never know, how many stories dissolved into silence because the women who lived them were considered unworthy of recording. We have administrative records, tallies of harem populations, occasional mentions in diplomatic correspondence, but the texture of their daily existence, the specific contours of their grief, the strategies they developed to preserve some fragment of self in a system designed to erase them, most of that is lost. The ones we do know about tend to be exceptional cases. The princess who became a sultan's favorite and gained unusual influence. The noblewoman whose brother later became king and negotiated her release. These stories get preserved because they're dramatic, because they have clear narrative arcs, because they ended in ways that Ottoman or European scribes found worth noting. But they're not representative. For every woman whose name survived, hundreds vanished into the unmarked footnotes of history. This erasure was part of the design. By making these women disappear into the harem's depths, by scattering their children across the empire, by forbidding them to maintain their former identities, the Ottomans didn't just conquer territory, they conquered memory itself. They made it difficult for future generations to even reconstruct what had been lost, to measure the full human cost of expansion. And in that deliberate obscurity, we confront something that transcends the specific cruelties of one empire. We see the universal truth of how power operates, how it writes histories that center itself and pushes its victims to the margins of the page. The Ottoman Empire fell more than a century ago. The harems are tourist sites now, their rooms empty except for explanatory plaques and the slow shuffle of guided tours. But walk through those spaces with the stories in mind, and you feel it. The weight of all those interrupted lives, all that transformed grief, all those identities forcibly rewritten. The stones remember what the history books abbreviate. We study empires through their victories and their monuments. We map their expansion in colored lines on classroom walls. But empires are built on specific human suffering, calculated cruelties that served strategic purposes, systems of control that operated in palaces and prisons simultaneously. What the Ottomans did to the wives of defeated warriors was not unique in human history. Every expanding power has its version of this story. But the Ottoman approach had a particular thoroughness to it, a bureaucratic efficiency that turned personal catastrophe into administrative process. And perhaps that's what should haunt us most. Not just that these things happened, but how easily they were systematized, how smoothly the machinery of conquest incorporated the destruction of families into its standard operating procedures, how little pause there was between victory on the battlefield and the dismantling of defeated households. Power, when unopposed, develops its own logic. It finds ways to justify whatever serves its expansion. It creates categories of people whose suffering becomes acceptable collateral damage. The conquered wives of the Ottoman era learned this in ways their bodies never forgot. The next time you see the grandeur of historical empires celebrated, remember, there were women behind those palace walls living through nightmares that their conquerors called policy. Their suffering wasn't incidental to the glory. It was foundational, and it deserves to be remembered with the same clarity we bring to remembering the sultans and the battles and the borders that shifted when the fighting stopped. Because history isn't just what happened, it's who survived to tell it, and who didn't, and why.